was not so, let's say, naively optimistic as to think that this would be an answer to the profundity of human grief and the reality of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I quite agree with you. I think from reading his poetry, I feel that serenity actually it's an eddy of meaning.
Exactly, well put.
It can be there for a moment as a surprise, as a gift, but indeed life has also the place for grief, really. And I'd like to read a poem where he talks very explicitly about the relationship between grief and this celebration of motion. And it's a poem where he mentions a very early event in his life, which was the death of his younger brother when he was a child, which was clearly a very early experience of grief that stayed very, very central to him. So this poem is called Easter Morning. I have a life that did not become, that turned aside and stopped, astonished. I hold it in me like a pregnancy, or as on a lap a child, not to grow old, but to dwell on. It is to his grave that I most frequently return and return, to ask what is wrong, what was wrong, to see it all by the light of a different necessity. But the grave will not heal, and the child, stirring, must share my grave with me, an old man, having gotten by on what was left. The child in me that could not become was not ready for others to go on into change, blessings and horrors, but stands there by the road where the mishap occurred, crying out for help. Come and fix this, or we can't get by. But the great ones who were to return, they could not or did not hear, and went on in a flurry. And now I say, in the graveyard, here lies the flurry. Now it can't come back with help or helpful asides. Now we all buy the bitter incompletions, pick up the knots of horror, silently raving, and go on to crashing into empty ends, not completions, not rondures the fullness has come into and spent itself from. I stand on the stump of a child, whether myself or my little brother who died, and yell as far as I can, I cannot leave this place. For me it is the dearest and the worst. It is life nearest to life, which is life lost. It is my place where I must stand and fall and fail, calling attention with tears to the branches not lofting bows into space, to the barren air that holds the world that was my world. Through the incompletions and completions, burn out, standing in the flash high burn momentary structure of ash, still it is a picture book letter perfect Easter morning. I have been for a walk. The wind is tranquil. The brook works without flashing in an abundant tranquility. The birds are lively with voice. I saw something I had never seen before. Two great birds, maybe eagles, black-winged, white-necked, and headed, came from the south, oaring the wings steadily. They went directly over me, high up, and kept on due north. But then one bird, the one behind, veered a little to the left, and the other bird kept on, seeming not to notice for a minute. The first began to circle, as if looking for something, coasting, resting its wings, on the downside of some of the circles. The other bird came back, and they both circled, looking perhaps for a draught. They turned a few more times, possibly rising, at least clearly resting, then flew on, falling into distance, till they broke across the local bush and trees. It was a sight of bountiful majesty and integrity, the having patterns and roots, breaking from them to explore other patterns or better ways to roots, and then the return, a dance sacred as the sap in the trees, permanent in its descriptions as the ripple round the brook's ripple stone, fresh as this particular flood of burn breaking across us now from the sun.
That's another long poem. Now, you chose it because I take it that you really like this poem, and I have to say that I like it until that last long stanza. Or I don't want to say like, because that's not what I mean. Let me phrase it in terms of a question, because I find that here it's a very atypical Ammons poem at the beginning, where he's actually going home, and there are others in the poem. There are aunts and family and other people. Mm-hmm. It's a moment of grief at a funeral, I presume, or there's some evocation of the gravesite. Mm-hmm. There's a dead young brother, and then there's this it seems like once he gets close to this human phenomenon of grief and loss, and so he goes back to his comfortable, familiar, almost escapist territory, which is to look at the flight of the birds and to say, well, there's this other world of nature where the law of human grief doesn't apply. Am I misreading that poem in your view?
Well, I understand how you would get there, in that the poem does have two parts, and the first one focuses very much on grief, and the second one goes back to this idea of the movement of nature. But I think the reason I like it is because there are some, the word return itself, actually, I think sort of undoes that duality and suggests that he's not escaping. And I'd like to point to, in the beginning he says, it is to his grave that I most frequently return and return. And a little bit later, he insists on the way completion and incompletion go together. And so I believe that when he mentions the return as a sacred dance, as the sap in the trees, right, as the brook at the end, the way that nature returns is actually not different from the way that he returns to grief. And that's what I like about the poem, is that it tells us that movement of nature that can seem like an escape and can seem like a sort of acceptance of the cycle of life as a consolation, actually that cycle is the very same cycle that also brings us back to grief and brings us back to human attachment, which I think is actually quite important for him, that attachment is part of that cycle. And I agree with you that without that attachment, then the movement of nature does seem like an escape. So that's why I like the fact that he does go back to the element of being attached to other human beings, being attached to countrysides, places, ideas, and how those two pass away, and that is very difficult.
What do you make of this child in him that either died, that it is to his grave I most frequently return and return? That's the life in him that never became. And of course, that seems to have his correlate in his little brother who died young. And you were mentioning earlier the dynamic between completion and incompletion. What do you think that life is that didn't become? And what kind of grave is this that he's returning to all the time? Frequently, at least.
Well, perhaps the life that was interrupted, right? That's sort of the beginning of the image, is his young brother's life that was interrupted. It's a life that could have gone in many, many ways, right? There are endless possibilities there. There's all of that great openness, and yet, of course, there's also great loss, because there's not one of these possibilities was realized. And I think that life in him is his double experience of tremendous grief and yet of awareness of the link between grief and the openness of many possibilities. And those are located in that same place. So I think that for himself, of course, he loses his own childhood by becoming an adult, and there's grief in that. And all of us have to, ultimately, we have one path in life. And yet I think the ability to return to this moment of loss is also an ability to change that path or open up new paths, or to meander a little bit, not to get stuck in one direction.
I think you're right. And when it's quite extraordinary how when human beings talk about the phenomenon of loss, everyone else seems to understand exactly what they're talking about. And no less so in the case of this poem, at least in its first half. Reminds me of something in Walden, by Thoreau, who must have had a certain importance for Ammons. He told me he did anyway. Where a famous enigmatic passage in Walden where Thoreau says, "I long ago lost a hound, a bay horse, and a turtle dove, and am still on their trail. Many are the travelers I have spoken to concerning them, describing their tracks and what calls they answered to. I have met one or two who have met the hound and the tramp of the horse, and even seen the dove disappear behind a cloud, and they seemed as anxious to recover them as if they had lost them themselves. And this seems to suggest that there's something binding in the experience of loss.